On the day a new American president was inaugurated, three names were announced as special ambassadors to Hollywood. One of them was Sylvester Stallone, one was Jon Voight, and the third, the name that made every journalist stop and read the sentence again, was Mel Gibson. The man Hollywood had declared dead. Because this was not simply a man who had made Mad Max and Lethal Weapon and Braveheart. This was the man who had won 2 Academy Awards in the same night, Best Picture and Best Director, in 1995. The man who had turned a $30 million act of personal faith into $612 million at the box office. The man who had been, at one precise and undeniable moment in cinema history, the most powerful filmmaker on the planet. And then he had one night in Malibu in 2006 that cost him his studio deal, his agents, his representation, and his standing in an industry he had spent 3 decades building. One night that produced a recording that the world heard, a recording that could not be undone. He spent 10 years in a kind of exile that Hollywood does not officially declare, but everyone understands. He kept working, nobody was watching. And then, in 2016, he made Hacksaw Ridge, and the Academy nominated him for Best Director. And then, the President of the United States made him an ambassador. That is not a comeback story. That is something far more complicated and far more American. What does a man have to do to earn back a place in the world he destroyed? And is earning it back even the right question? If Mel Gibson's journey through glory, through ruin, through silence, and through whatever this is now, has ever made you stop and wonder what you actually believe about talent and consequence, hit like as tribute to one of the most genuinely unresolved stories Hollywood has ever produced. Because this story does not have a clean ending, and that is exactly why it still matters. On January 20th, 2025, while the cameras of the entire world were trained on the inauguration ceremony in Washington, a statement was released that had nothing to do with policy or governance, and everything to do with the strangest, most unresolved second act in the history of American entertainment. President Donald Trump announced 3 special ambassadors to Hollywood. The role was largely ceremonial, a gesture toward an industry the administration viewed with a particular combination of suspicion and fascination. Sylvester Stallone, Jon Voight, and Mel Gibson. 3 men, 3 legends. 3 careers that had collectively spanned more than a century of American cinema. But only one of those names made the room go quiet. Stallone was beloved. Voight was respected. Gibson was something else. Something that did not have a clean word attached to it. He was not rehabilitated exactly. He was not forgiven exactly. He was not forgotten exactly. He was simply there, at 70 years old, standing in a space that the industry had spent nearly 2 decades trying to make permanently unavailable to him. The announcement produced 2 distinct reactions, and both of them were honest. One side saw a man of extraordinary talent receiving a recognition that his body of work had always justified. The other side saw an appointment that raised questions about what behavior a culture is ultimately willing to absorb in exchange for genius. Neither reaction was wrong, and the fact that neither reaction was wrong is precisely what makes Mel Gibson the most genuinely complicated figure that Hollywood has produced in the last 50 years. 70 years old. 5 Academy Award wins attached to his name as director and producer. A scandal that the industry called unforgivable. A film that the industry eventually had to nominate anyway. And now a title, Ambassador, that nobody, including Mel Gibson himself, could have predicted on the morning of July 28, 2006. To understand how a man arrives at that moment in Washington, you have to go back to the beginning. Not the glamorous beginning, not the Mad Max beginning, the real beginning. Mel Gerard Gibson was born on the 3rd of January 1956 in Peekskill, New York, a small city on the Hudson River that has produced exactly one global cinema icon and shows no particular signs of producing another. He was the 6th of 11 children. His father, Hutton Gibson, was a man of fierce intelligence, deep religious conviction, and views that would later become a source of significant public controversy in their own right. His mother, Anne Patricia, was Irish-born, a woman who brought the cadences and devotions of another culture into a household already defined by intensity. 11 children in a house defined by intensity is not a childhood. It is a training ground. Hutton Gibson won a substantial settlement from a railroad injury lawsuit in the 1960s. Enough money to make a decision that would alter the trajectory of every life in that house. He decided to move the family to Australia. The year was 1968. Mel Gibson was 12 years old. It is worth pausing on that moment. A 12-year-old boy, born American, uprooted from everything familiar, relocated to the other side of the planet, to a country whose accent he did not share and whose culture he did not yet understand. That experience of being simultaneously an insider and an outsider, of belonging fully to no single place, would surface decades later in the characters he chose to play and the stories he chose to tell. The displaced warrior, the man who fights for a homeland that was never fully his. The outsider who becomes the legend. But in 1968, he was simply a boy who had to figure out how to survive a new country. He was, by his own admission, not a particularly distinguished student. He was not the boy the teachers remembered. He was not the athlete who dominated the field. He was something quieter and harder to categorize, observant, restless, with a quality that the people who knew him then struggled to describe precisely, but consistently describe as present. He was extraordinarily present in a room. He watched people. He remembered what he saw. His sister sent his application to the National Institute of Dramatic Art in Sydney, one of the most rigorous and respected theater training institutions in the Southern Hemisphere, without, by some accounts, telling him she had done it. Whether the story is precisely true in every detail, or whether it has been shaped by the retrospective glamour that attaches to origin stories of the famous, the essential fact is verified. Mel Gibson studied at the National Institute of Dramatic Art, and the National Institute of Dramatic Art changed everything, because it was there, in the discipline of a training program that treated acting not as performance, but as craft, not as self-expression, but as a rigorous and demanding technical skill, that Gibson discovered what he actually was. He was not a student who was merely adequate. He was a student who understood at a cellular level what it meant to inhabit another human being completely. His instructors recognized it. His classmates recognized it. The camera, when it finally met him, recognized it instantly and without hesitation. In 1979, a low-budget Australian science fiction film called Mad Max was released with a budget of 400,000 Australian dollars, a figure so modest it barely qualified as a production. The studio had no particular expectations. The director, George Miller, had made nothing of note before it, and the lead actor was a 23-year-old American-Australian nobody had heard of. Mad Max earned $100 million worldwide. The nobody had a name now, and the name was Mel Gibson. 2 years later, Mad Max 2. The Road Warrior arrived and confirmed that the first film was not an accident. The performance was rawer, the control more precise, the physical commitment more total. The world that had been mildly curious about Mel Gibson became actively interested. Hollywood, the Hollywood he had been exported away from at age 12, started paying attention. But it was not Hollywood that defined the next chapter. It was a single casting decision in 1987 that would produce the most enduring partnership of his career, and the franchise that an entire generation would grow up watching. Lethal Weapon. Mel Gibson and Danny Glover. A film that cost $15 million and earned $120 million worldwide in its first release alone. A film that generated 3 sequels. A franchise that, across 4 films, accumulated more than $950 million globally. The formula was deceptively simple. 2 men who should not work together, who work together so well that the audience refuses to let them stop. Gibson brought the volatility. Glover brought the gravity. Between them, they created something that felt genuinely human inside a genre that typically traded humanity for spectacle. He was not simply a movie star by the end of the 1980s. He was something more specific and more powerful than that. He was the movie star, the one whose name on a poster was, by itself, a financial guarantee. And he was still, in the private accounting of his own ambitions, entirely unsatisfied. Because Mel Gibson had never wanted only to act. He had wanted to direct. He had wanted to build worlds rather than simply inhabit them. And in 1995, he would get that chance. And use it to produce one of the most decorated films of the decade. What happens when the biggest movie star in the world decides that being a star is no longer enough? There is a specific kind of ambition that does not announce itself loudly. It accumulates quietly, year after year, behind every role accepted and every role declined, behind every conversation about story and structure and what cinema is actually capable of doing to a human being sitting in a darkened room. Mel Gibson had been carrying that ambition since his days at the National Institute of Dramatic Art in Sydney. By the early 1990s, it had become impossible to contain. He had directed a small film called The Man Without a Face in 1993, a modest, personal project that received respectful notices and demonstrated that his instincts behind the camera were genuine. But modest and personal was not what Gibson was building toward. He was building toward something epic, something that required not just a camera and a crew, but a conviction so total that everyone around him would have to believe it simply because he did. The project was Braveheart, the story of William Wallace, the 13th century Scottish warrior who led a rebellion against English rule and paid for it with his life. Was, on paper, an extraordinarily difficult film to make. It required thousands of extras, elaborate battle sequences, a historical period that demanded meticulous reconstruction, and a central performance that had to carry the moral weight of an entire nation's longing for freedom. It required a director who could hold all of that simultaneously without losing the human story at the center of it. Gibson was that director, and he was also, simultaneously, its lead actor. Braveheart was released in 1995. The production had been enormous, filmed largely in Scotland and Ireland, with a budget that reached approximately $72 million, which was considered a significant financial risk for a historical epic starring a man who had never directed anything approaching that scale. The studio was cautious. The industry was watching. The film earned $210 million worldwide. And then, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences nominated it for 10 Academy Awards. And then, on the night of March 25, 1996, Braveheart won 5 of them. Best Picture, Best Director, Best Cinematography, Best Film Editing, Best Makeup. Mel Gibson walked to the stage that night and collected 2 of those awards himself. Best Picture as producer, Best Director as filmmaker. He was 39 years old. He had been making films for 16 years, and he had just achieved what virtually every director in Hollywood spends an entire career reaching for, and most never touch. He was, at that precise moment, the most powerful filmmaker in the American industry. Not one of the most powerful. The most powerful. The man whose creative judgment had been validated by the highest formal recognition the industry possesses. It would have been entirely reasonable, at that point, for Mel Gibson to spend the next decade making films exactly like Braveheart. Large, prestigious, historically grounded epics that the Academy would reward and the studios would finance without hesitation. That was the safe path. That was the path that a man primarily motivated by status and security would have taken. Gibson took a different path entirely. For several years following Braveheart, he continued acting. Ransom in 1996, Conspiracy Theory and Lethal Weapon 4 through the late 90s, The Patriot in 2000, Signs in 2002. Substantial films. Films that earned substantial money. But the project that was consuming his deepest attention during those years was not a studio picture. It was not a film that any studio would touch. It was a 2-hour meditation on the final 12 hours of the life of Jesus Christ, filmed entirely in Aramaic and Latin, with no stars other than Jim Caviezel in the central role, with no conventional commercial appeal, and with a proposed budget of approximately $30 million that Mel Gibson was prepared to fund entirely from his own resources after every major studio in Hollywood declined to participate. The studios did not simply pass on the passion of the Christ. They passed on it with a particular energy, the energy of an industry that believed the project was not merely uncommercial, but potentially career-ending. Who, the conventional wisdom asked, would pay to watch a subtitled religious film about crucifixion for 2 hours? What audience existed for that? What demographic were the projections built on? Gibson had an answer that the studios could not model in a spreadsheet. He believed, not abstractly, not performatively, but with the total conviction of a man whose Catholic faith had been the central organizing principle of his inner life for as long as he could remember. He believed that the story was the most important story ever told. He believed that telling it with absolute fidelity, with the historical languages, with the unflinching physical reality, with no softening and no Hollywood sentimentality, was not a commercial risk, but a moral obligation. The Passion of the Christ was released on Ash Wednesday, February 25, 2004. It earned $612 million worldwide. It became, at the time of its release, the highest-grossing independent film in the history of cinema. A film that no studio would finance. A film that its director paid for with his own money. A film that the industry had collectively decided was a folly. $612 million. The film was also, from the moment of its release, deeply controversial. Critics and scholars, including prominent voices in the Jewish community, argued that the portrayal of the Pharisees and the Jewish leadership in the events leading to the crucifixion crossed the line into anti-Semitic representation. Gibson rejected those accusations directly and repeatedly. The debate was genuine, substantive, and unresolved. It would acquire a devastating new dimension 2 years later, because in the summer of 2006, Mel Gibson was driving through Malibu at night with a blood alcohol level nearly twice the legal limit. And everything that came next would make every previous controversy look, by comparison, like a rehearsal. There are moments in public life that function as permanent dividing lines, before and after. The world on one side and a different world entirely on the other. For Mel Gibson, that dividing line has a precise timestamp, the early morning hours of July 28, 2006, on the Pacific Coast Highway in Malibu, California. He was pulled over by a Los Angeles County Sheriff's deputy named James Mee at approximately 2 in the morning. His blood alcohol level was measured at .12, nearly twice the legal limit in California. That alone would have been a story. A famous man, a drunk driving arrest, the predictable cycle of tabloid coverage and publicist statements and carefully worded apologies. Manageable, the kind of incident that Hollywood had absorbed hundreds of times before and would absorb hundreds of times again. But what happened during that arrest was not manageable. Deputy Mee's arrest report documented what Gibson said during the detention. The words were not ambiguous. They were not open to interpretation. Gibson said, according to the verified documentation, that Jews were responsible for all the wars in the world. He made additional statements that were anti-Semitic in character. He directed a gendered slur at a female officer present at the scene. The arrest report was leaked. The words became public. And within 72 hours, the career that had taken 30 years to build was in the process of being systematically dismantled. Warner Brothers, the studio with which Gibson had one of the most significant creative and commercial relationships in Hollywood, ended that relationship. His agents dropped him. His publicist resigned. His management walked away. The infrastructure of representation and institutional support that a career of that magnitude requires, the network of relationships built across decades of films and deals and handshakes and shared successes, collapsed with a speed that was, even to those who had seen Hollywood's machinery work before, striking. Gibson issued a public apology. He said the words were not who he was. He acknowledged the alcohol. He asked for forgiveness from the Jewish community specifically. And he did so in language that was direct and without qualification. Whether that apology was sufficient, whether any apology could be sufficient for words of that nature, was a question that different people answered differently, and continue to answer differently. What was not a matter of interpretation was the practical consequence. Hollywood has a formal system of awards and a formal system of contracts. It also has an informal system, a system of inclusion and exclusion that operates without written rules and without official announcements, but that is nonetheless entirely real and entirely effective. Mel Gibson was placed, after July 28, 2006, on the wrong side of that informal system. He was not banned. He was not prosecuted for his speech. He was simply made to understand, through the withdrawal of opportunity and the closure of doors, that the industry had decided something about him. The situation worsened in 2010. Recordings of phone calls between Gibson and his then-partner, the Russian musician Oksana Grigorieva, with whom he had a daughter, Lucia, born in October 2009, became public. The recordings contained language that was, by any measure, extreme and threatening. Grigorieva filed allegations of domestic violence. The legal proceedings that followed were prolonged and complicated. In 2011, Gibson pleaded no contest to a charge of battery against Grigorieva. He was sentenced to 3 years of probation, 36 months of domestic violence counseling, and community service. He completed those requirements. The legal resolution did not resolve the public accounting. It simply added another layer to an already dense and contested record. What is possible to say with factual accuracy about that period is this: the events of 2006 and 2010 represented two distinct categories of failure. The arrest and the anti-Semitic statements were made while Gibson was intoxicated, which does not excuse them, and Gibson himself has never argued that it does, but which is a relevant contextual fact. The recordings from 2010 documented behavior in a private relationship that became public through circumstances that were themselves legally contested. Both categories of failure were real. Both caused genuine harm, and both attached themselves permanently to a public record that no amount of subsequent achievement would fully separate from his name. He was 54 years old when the probation was handed down. He had 2 Academy Awards. He had a franchise that had earned nearly $1 billion. He had made the highest-grossing independent film in the history of cinema. And he had not directed a single film in a decade. The question that the industry was quietly asking, the question that Gibson himself must have been asking in whatever private accounting he conducted during those years, was whether he ever would again. What does a decade of silence do to a man who was built to make things? And what does he make when he finally decides the silence is over? There is a particular kind of professional exile that does not look like exile from the outside. The man still works. His name still appears in credits. He is not physically removed from the industry. He is simply removed from its center, relocated to its edges, where the projects are smaller and the audiences are thinner and the cultural conversation has moved on to other names and other stories. That is where Mel Gibson spent the decade between 2006 and 2016. He acted. He appeared in Edge of Darkness in 2010, a reasonable thriller that performed modestly and reminded nobody of Lethal Weapon. He appeared in The Beaver in 2011, directed by Jodie Foster, a film that received genuinely strong reviews for his performance and virtually no audience. He appeared in Machete Kills in 2013, a deliberately absurdist action film that was the kind of project available to a man who needed to keep working but whose options had been significantly narrowed. He did not direct. For 10 years during which his contemporaries continued building legacies, during which the industry he had helped shape continued evolving, during which a new generation of filmmakers arrived who had grown up watching Braveheart without necessarily knowing the name of the man who made it, Mel Gibson sat on the director's side of the camera and watched. He spoke, in interviews from that period, about sobriety. He had acknowledged for years that his relationship with alcohol was not casual, that it was chronic, that it had cost him in ways that extended far beyond the night in Malibu. The work of those 10 years, by his own account, was not primarily professional. It was internal. It was the slower and less visible work of a man trying to understand what he had done and what he was, and whether those two things were permanently identical or whether they could eventually be separated. He did not make grand public declarations about transformation. He did not conduct the kind of staged rehabilitation tour that the modern media ecosystem provides as infrastructure for the famous who have fallen. The carefully scheduled interview circuit, the documentary about the journey, the social media presence curated to demonstrate growth. Gibson's absence from those mechanisms was notable. Whether it reflected genuine privacy or a strategic assessment of what would and would not be received, the practical result was the same. He was quiet in an era that rewards noise for a very long time. And then, in 2016, he was not quiet anymore. The project was Hacksaw Ridge. The story was real. The verified, documented, extraordinary story of Desmond Doss, a Seventh-day Adventist from Virginia who enlisted in the United States Army during the Second World War and served as a combat medic at the Battle of Okinawa. Doss refused, on religious grounds, to carry or use a weapon of any kind. He went into one of the most brutal battles of the Pacific Theater entirely unarmed. And on the escarpment at Hacksaw Ridge, under fire, alone, over the course of a single night, he saved the lives of 75 men, lowering them one by one over the edge of the ridge to safety while praying, with each one, the same prayer. Lord, help me get one more. Desmond Doss received the Medal of Honor from President Harry Truman in October 1945, the first conscientious objector in American history to receive that distinction. The story was, in its bones, a story about a man who held to his convictions under conditions designed to make convictions feel like luxuries. It was a story about faith demonstrated not through declaration, but through action. It was a story about what a human being is capable of when every external pressure says to stop and the internal pressure says to continue. It was, in ways that required no elaboration, a story that Mel Gibson understood from the inside. The film was made for $40 million, a modest budget for the scope of what Gibson was attempting. The battle sequences at Hacksaw Ridge are among the most viscerally realized combat photography in modern American cinema. They are not glorifying. They are not abstract. They are the kind of filmmaking that makes an audience understand, physically and not merely intellectually, what it cost the men on that escarpment to keep moving. Hacksaw Ridge was released in November 2016. It earned $175 million worldwide against that $40 million budget. And the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences nominated it for 6 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. Including Best Director, Mel Gibson's second nomination in that category, a decade after the industry had collectively decided he was finished. He did not win. Moonlight won Best Picture that year, and Damien Chazelle won Best Director for La La Land. But the nomination itself carried a weight that transcended the award, because a nomination for Best Director is not issued by a machine or determined by an algorithm. It is issued by the director's branch of the Academy, by the men and women who make films for a living, who understand what directing actually requires, and who choose to recognize the work they consider most significant in a given year. The director's branch of the Academy looked at what Mel Gibson had made 10 years after the night in Malibu, and they put his name on the list. That decision did not resolve the moral questions. It did not constitute forgiveness, and it was not intended to. It constituted something more specific, and in some ways more interesting, a professional judgment rendered by professionals that the work was undeniable. The work had always been undeniable. That was, and remains, the central tension of the Mel Gibson story. That the man and the work are both real, both documented, and both impossible to fully separate from each other, and yet impossible to fully collapse into each other either. Hacksaw Ridge did not end the debate about Mel Gibson. It guaranteed that the debate would continue at a higher level, with higher stakes, for as long as he kept making things, which raised, for the first time in a decade, a genuinely open question. What comes next for a man who has just proved, against every prediction, that he still has something to say? There is a version of the Mel Gibson story that ends with Hacksaw Ridge. The fallen giant returns. The Academy acknowledges the talent. The industry, reluctantly and without fanfare, reopens a door it had spent 10 years holding shut. Curtain. Resolution. The narrative arc closes with the satisfying symmetry that audiences have been trained to expect from stories about public fall and private redemption. That version is not the true version. Because Mel Gibson did not stop at Hacksaw Ridge. He did not accept the nomination as a benediction and retreat into a comfortable late-career respectability. He kept moving, and the direction he moved in was, characteristically, not the direction that would have been easiest or most strategically advisable. The project that has occupied the deepest chamber of his creative attention since Hacksaw Ridge is not another war film. It is not another prestige historical epic designed to reassure the Academy that he has learned the right lessons. It is the Passion of the Christ. Resurrection. the sequel to the most controversial film he has ever made, to the film that earned $612 million and generated accusations of anti-Semitism that he has never fully resolved with his critics, to the film that is inseparable from the most catastrophic chapter of his public life. The choice to return to that material, to that story, to those accusations, to that entire landscape of unresolved controversy, tells you something essential about how Mel Gibson is constructed. He does not make decisions by calculating which path generates the least friction. He makes decisions by following the conviction that has been the engine of his creative life since the beginning, that the story matters more than the consequences of telling it. The sequel has been confirmed as an active project across multiple interviews in the years following Hacksaw Ridge. Gibson has spoken about it with the same totality of belief that characterized his description of the original film before any studio had agreed to finance it. Jim Caviezel, who played Christ in the original, is confirmed to return. The theological and narrative territory the film will cover, the resurrection, the events of the 3 days between the crucifixion and the empty tomb, is, if anything, more doctrinally charged than the passion narrative itself. Whether the passion of the Christ, resurrection will generate the same commercial phenomenon as its predecessor, whether it will generate a new cycle of the same controversies, whether it will find the same audience of believers who turned the original into the highest-grossing independent film in cinema history, none of that is knowable in advance. What is knowable is that Gibson intends to make it. And when Mel Gibson intends to make something, the industry has learned, across 50 years of evidence, that the probability of him actually making it is very high. Lethal Weapon 5 is also in development, with Gibson potentially returning not as an actor but as director, closing a loop that began in 1987 with a buddy cop film that nobody expected to define a generation, and that somehow did exactly that. The details of his involvement remain in the negotiation stage, but the project is active. Roger Murtaugh and Martin Riggs, or whatever version of those men survives 4 decades of living, may yet have one final chapter. And then there is the man himself, at 70, in January 2025, sitting across from Joe Rogan on the most listened-to podcast in the world, and talking about something that had nothing to do with film at all. He had lost 30 pounds, not gradually, not through the slow discipline of a man managing his health for the long term, but through a specific dietary approach, the same protocol popularized by Dana White, the president of the Ultimate Fighting Championship, involving a diet centered almost entirely on animal protein and fat, eliminating most plant-based foods, and producing a physical transformation visible enough that the audience immediately noticed it. Gibson spoke about the change with the same directness he brings to everything. No hedging, no qualification, no performance of reluctant confession. He had made a decision. The decision had produced results. He was reporting the results. It was, in miniature, a portrait of the man. At 70 years old, after everything, after the Oscars and the scandal and the exile and the return and the nomination and the ambassadorship, he was still making decisions that nobody had told him to make, still producing results that nobody had predicted, still sitting in rooms and talking with a directness that made the people listening pay attention even when they were not entirely sure what to do with what they were hearing. His personal life in this period has not been without its own complications. His relationship with Rosalind Ross, the screenwriter and director who is 26 years his junior, and with whom he has a son, Milo, born in March 2017, ended in 2025. Gibson has 9 children in total, across 3 relationships spanning 4 decades. The arc of his private life has been no less complicated than the arc of his public one. In December 2025, he appeared in Hunting Season, adding another credit to a late career filmography that continues to accumulate. In February 2025, he appeared at MegaCon in Orlando. Not a film festival, not an awards ceremony, but a fan convention. A place where the audience that simply loves what he has made shows up in person to say so. There is something in that choice, in the willingness to stand in a convention hall and meet the people who watched Braveheart and Lethal Weapon and The Passion and Hacksaw Ridge, and decided, regardless of everything else, that the work mattered to them, that resists the more complicated analyses and sits instead in something simpler and more durable. The work mattered. It mattered to an enormous number of people, across 50 years, across multiple languages and cultures and generations. That fact does not resolve the other facts, but it is, nonetheless, a fact. What do you do with a man whose work you cannot dismiss and whose record you cannot entirely forgive? What does the culture do with a talent that arrived at the wrong time, or perhaps at precisely the right one? A talent that forced a reckoning not just with one man's failures, but with the industry's own complicated relationship with genius and consequence. On the 3rd of January, 2026, Mel Gibson turned 70 years old. 70 years. A number that, in the accounting of a human life, demands a kind of reckoning. Not the reckoning of the courtroom or the industry tribunal or the cultural jury that has been deliberating his case for 20 years, but the quieter, more fundamental reckoning of a man who has lived long enough to see what his life actually added up to, independent of what anyone else decided it meant. What it added up to is this: a boy born in Peekskill, New York, relocated at 12 to the other side of the planet, who walked into an acting school in Sydney and discovered something about himself that no classroom had previously been able to name. A young man who stood in front of a camera for the first time and produced, at 23, a performance that earned $100 million on a $400,000 investment. A filmmaker who stood on a stage at the Academy Awards and collected 2 of the industry's highest honors in a single night. A man of faith who spent $30 million of his own money on a story that no studio would touch and watched it earn $612 million from an audience the industry had forgotten existed. A man who had one night, one catastrophic, documented, indefensible night that cost him everything the industry had given him. A man who spent 10 years in a wilderness of his own making, working quietly, living with what he had done, building toward something. A filmmaker who returned with Hacksaw Ridge and received, from the people whose professional judgment is the only judgment that matters in that specific arena, a nomination for Best Director that said, without ambiguity, the work is still here. And then a president of the United States put his name on a list of ambassadors. None of that resolves into a clean lesson. None of it produces the kind of moral clarity that a culture increasingly organized around the demand for moral clarity is comfortable with. The anti-Semitic statements of 2006 were real. The recordings from 2010 were real. The legal proceedings and the conviction were real. And Braveheart was real. And The Passion of the Christ was real. And Hacksaw Ridge was real. And the 75 men that Desmond Doss saved on that escarpment, men whose story might never have reached the audience it reached without a filmmaker willing and capable of telling it with that particular fidelity, were real. All of it is real, simultaneously, without the convenience of cancellation in either direction. The American story, at its most honest and most uncomfortable, has always been a story about people who contain contradictions too large for simple resolution. About talent that arrives packaged with damage. About failure that does not neatly erase achievement. about achievement that does not neatly erase failure, about the persistent, unresolved question of what we owe each other. As an industry, as an audience, as a culture, when the man who made the thing we cannot stop watching is also the man who said the thing we cannot stop remembering. Mel Gibson has not answered that question. He has simply continued to exist inside it, making things, losing things, building things, breaking things, and refusing, at 70, as at 30, as at 50, to become the simplified version of himself that would be easier for everyone else to process. The Passion of the Christ. Resurrection is coming. Lethal Weapon. 5 may be coming. Whatever comes after those is unknown, because with Mel Gibson, the next chapter has never been predictable from the chapter before it. What is certain is that the question his life poses, about talent and consequence, about forgiveness and its limits, about what a culture chooses to remember and what it chooses to release, is not a question that will be answered by his next film, or his next decade, or perhaps ever. And that is not a failure of resolution. That is what an honest story looks like. Is that enough? For you, watching this, with everything you now know, to decide what you believe about Mel Gibson? Leave your answer in the comments. Not the easy answer, the honest one. If this story made you think about something you hadn't thought about before, subscribe to Golden Fame News, because this channel exists for exactly that. The stories that don't resolve cleanly, told by the people who lived them, for the audience willing to sit with the complexity. The story of Mel Gibson is not over. At 70, it is entirely possible that the most important chapter has not yet been written.